While countries like China forward with AI and military applications, democracies like the United States are working to balance the game-changing capabilities that AI provides with public concerns about when, how, and why AI-enabled tools are used for a country's defense. In this next session, we'll learn how DIU and others are helping apply the DoD's ethical principles for AI to accelerate the adoption of AI for national security while ensuring responsible, lawful use of this promising technology. So with that, I'd like to introduce our incredible three panelists for this session. First of which is going to be Mr. John Stockton. He is the co-founder of Quantifind. Joining him will be Bryce Goodman, the Chief Strategist for Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning at DIU. And finally, we're going to be having Carol Smith. And she is the Senior Research Scientist in Human-Machine Interaction at Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute. Please welcome our three panelists. Come on up. Welcome. Join us. And I will let my esteemed guests take it away from me.
Excellent. Thank you, Bobby. And welcome to our panel. So today we are going to be talking about artificial intelligence and looking at the ethics and responsible AI and how that can be done. I will ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. Bryce, if you could go ahead.
Sure. Bryce Goodman. I'm Chief Strategist for Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning at Defense Innovation Unit. I've been around DIU for quite some time, and I'm excited to be here today.
And John?
Great, thanks, Carol. My name is John Stockton. I'm co-founder of Quantifind. We're a startup out of Stanford. We build AI products for open source risk assessment for organizations and individuals. We usually work with banks. I've been leading a SWAT team to expand our technology to law enforcement defense applications that we'll talk about today in the context of responsible AI.
Excellent. Thank you both. Wonderful. So, Bryce, I will ask you to just start us off and tell us a bit about the DIU mission and how you work with the commercial sector.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Carol. So DIU is a DoD entity. We're within the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, and we are focused on deploying commercial technology in support of national security. We do this by running what we call a commercial solution opening program, or CSO. And during the CSO process, we work with DoD partners to identify DoD needs. We then put out a solicitation describing that need. We receive bids from lots of companies, big companies, small companies. Most of the companies have never done work with the DoD or, for that matter, the US government before. We then run a down selection process and get folks onto contract, usually within a matter of months. And we then have a 1 to 2 year prototype period where we are developing and testing and deploying that technology with our partner in an operational setting. And if we're successful, at the end of that, we can transition onto a production contract that allows that technology to be scaled out across the services. We have 6 different technology areas. Artificial intelligence is just one of those. Others include things like space and human systems and cyber. We have a new advanced energy and materials portfolio. And one of the things that makes us unique is that we operate jointly. So across all of the services, all the combatant commands, we work with many of the 3-letter agencies, DIA, NGA, you name it. We've even got projects now with NOAA. And the State Department, which is exciting. So we really are focused on whole of government efforts in the security space, and therefore we've gotten to have access to a wide variety of programs that expose us to substantial breadth and depth of AI applications within the DoD.
Excellent, excellent. And to remind those who may have forgotten, those DoD ethical principles are responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. And can you talk a bit about how you are operationalizing the DoD AI ethical principles?
Yeah, absolutely. So those principles were developed originally by the Defense Innovation Board, and that was a 2-year process, consulting with academia, industry, government folks, trying to come up with what would be 5 sort of core pillars that we could build our responsible AI infrastructure around. And we think that those are 5 really solid principles. They're concise. I'd encourage anybody who's interested to go on the DoD website, and you can read a fairly lengthy report describing how those principles were conceived. So we think that's tremendous work. We at DIU are in the business of executing projects, right? We're not a policy organization. We are, in the business of getting down into the trenches and writing code, deploying code, et cetera. And so consequently, we needed a way to take these principles and put them into practice, right? How do you translate, a principle around traceability into something that an engineer is going to understand? That a product manager is going to say, okay, yeah, that's how I'm going to adapt my product to make sure that principle is being recognized. So that's really the gap that we've been seeking to address. And private companies like Quantifind, who you'll hear about later, have put a bunch of thought into these same issues. And we've been fortunate to talk to Quantifind as well as a bunch of other companies to understand, how are they tackling these challenges within their own business. And at the end of the day, what we've done is we've taken input not only from our own experience, running AI programs over the past 5 years, but also talking to folks out in industry and academia, and trying to put together a very practical, pragmatic sort of framework that consists of a series of questions that we ask at each stage within an AI project. So we see AI projects being comprised of a planning stage, right? This is when everybody's excited. What is it that we're going to do? We need to out in the world. And what we've done is we've put together, as I said, a set of questions that we ask at each stage. And we also have documentation that accompanies those questions. And the real purpose of this, which I'll get into the questions in a moment, but the real purpose is to provoke discussion, right? We operate from the belief that the answers are far less important than making sure that the questions themselves are raised and making sure that we're all clear about where we do have answers and also where we don't. I
think Bryce is having some connection issues. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I don't know where you lost me, but I'm just going to plow ahead.
That's fine.
So there are 3 things that I want to say up front before diving into to the actual questions. The first is that ultimately we think that responsible AI is a process, not a checklist, right? It's not a static thing. There's no single document that once you've filled that out, you can guarantee yourself, you have a responsible program. Instead, it needs to be a continuous and iterative process that we're engaged in. The second is that we're not trying to strive for absolute perfection. We're instead trying to identify what are major defects, right? So this is more, how can we avoid the worst outcomes? And then lastly, not all of our programs are going to make it through this framework, and that needs to be an acceptable outcome. Okay, so into the meat of it, the planning stage, which is the first stage, is comprised of 5 key questions. The first is, have we clearly defined tasks, quantitative performance metrics, and a baseline against which to evaluate system performance? So we're really getting into, have we narrowed down, is AI actually relevant to the problem at hand? And do we have a way of measuring when we've been successful that aligns with the operational use case? Second question, have we evaluated ownership of, access to, provenance of, and relevance of candidate data and models? So really being clear about tracing how the data has been obtained, how it's being used, as well as how those models are being built, how the ownership works over those models, and so forth. Third question is, who might be affected by the system? Who are the end users, so the people using the system, but also stakeholders, and responsible mission owner who owns that system, right? We believe that it's really critical to have a named individual who's responsible for overseeing all changes within that AI system. Fourth, have we conducted harms modeling to assess the likelihood and magnitude of different kinds of harms? So this could be harms ranging from the very obvious physical and psychological harms to more sort of almost conceptual harms, like are we eroding free speech, or are we creating a tool that could in some way hinder the democratic process? We take a lot of time during this step. And really, this is the kind of catastrophizing stage, right? Where we're trying to identify what are all the things that could go wrong. Because if we don't spend that time really thinking through all the ways that a program can go wrong, we're not able to build in those safeguards to make sure that that doesn't happen. And finally, we ask, have we identified the process for system rollback, right? For taking a system that doesn't function offline and for identifying errors. To be clear, errors will occur in practice. Even a nearly perfect model is going to make a wrong prediction someday. So it's important to design workflows that are robust to those areas. I'll just go really quickly through the other two stages. Development. This is where we consider how a data and model can be protected from manipulation, so adversarial input, etc. We go into defining reporting processes for system performance. So this feeds into sort of standard testing and evaluation type thing. And then we identify roles and persons who have the power to make and certify changes. And then finally, when we get into deployment, we're thinking about things like task and data validation, functional testing, harms assessment, quality control, and so forth. So keep an eye on our website, diu.mil. We're going to be releasing our formal report in the next month, which is going to include not only a lot more detail about what I've talked about, but also will include 2 case studies, including Quantifying, that really shows how this works in practice, because that's really, I think, where it becomes clearest.
Excellent. Excellent. And John, can you give us your perspective on this work? What's your experience been like working with DIU? What has Quantifying's experience been like?
Yeah, thanks for the setup, Bryce and Carol. Yes, again, John, Quantifying. It's been great. So we've been working on one of the CSOs that Bryce mentioned for the last year or so. And I'll speak to kind of the responsible AI part of it, but I'll start with a little bit of the overall experience. But when we get into the AI, it's all about the artifacts that we're developing, in addition to kind of the worksheets that Bryce mentioned. There are these model cards and risk cards and other things that we can use to really effectively align and document as kind of a conversational piece to make sure that we're all on the same page with these issues. So first of all, the experience with DIU has been excellent. They've been efficient, transparent, very Silicon Valley friendly in the way they operate. So that's been appreciated. And for the responsible AI project that we're kind of being the guinea pig on, they've been very clear on what's been established, what hasn't on their side. It's about where they're trying to go with us, like Bryce was saying, not imposing these onerous constraints that tax our progress on these other, what might be perceived as more important technical fronts, right? So basically where we're at is there's all these high level principles. Bryce mentioned the DoD ones. There's also the ODNI ones, a few other agencies. Each agency kind of has their own. There's older kind of executive orders that are relevant. And so we had to kind of consolidate some of those. And then it gets down to operationalizing them. But I do recommend, I think you're going to share some links of those that exist for people to go look at to have a sense of what we're talking about. If you look at those principles, I mean, they all share, there's some overlap there, and they all share, and there's things like equitable and about bias, but there's also ones that you might be surprised about that are more kind of government focused, like governable and controllability. And so we need to translate those into technical constraints, and they beg questions, equitable to who, how governable. So you have to be really specific. And the great thing is DIU is technical enough to be able to go back and forth with us on those issues. They've welcomed our input, and importantly, everybody seems to care. Like our team cares about the end result. DIU obviously does, and even the DoD and customer does, which is critical, because if they weren't bought in, then this would all be for naught. So it's something everyone wants to get right from the design phase, that these constraints kind of are built in as opposed to tacked on after the fact. So yeah, to get more operational, let's talk about some of those artifacts as tangible, deliverables of this process. And overall, like I said, people talk about these AI alignment problems. What that means very explicitly here, not just in an abstract philosophical sense, is that we need to set up some documents and artifacts to actually iterate over as a means of communication, to align, users represented by DIU and the agencies here, and the people building the AI, Quantifying in this case. So I'll go, there's 3 kind of classes I'll talk about here. You can imagine other ones like data cards and such, but there's the worksheets and the process that Bryce outlined. I won't go into detail since he did there, but those are essentially, question response style, how the principles apply to our product specifically. And that's really a great opportunity to put things on the table, right? Again, like Bryce is saying, you don't have to answer things perfectly, just, own up, radical transparency, talk about things you're worried about that they maybe haven't thought of, and be proactive about it. And then the next one on top of worksheets is these model cards. So some people in the audience may be aware of some kind of standards that are developing industry and across government on documenting models with model cards. They're promoting standards that really try to define a model. What goes into it, what goes out, what does it do, give specific examples, talk about its strengths and its weaknesses. And the weaknesses are just as important as the strengths here. I use the analogy, it's like a scouting report, right? Think of the model or the product that it's using as kind of a teammate of yours in an augmented intelligence sense. You need to know where that teammate is strong and weak such that you can override it in the field or in battlefield or on the ground situations. There is a point there of like, are you talking about the granular models or the overall system as a model? Because sometimes the government uses that language. And you need to do both. You need to talk about the kind of organism and the organs within and kind of ladder that up. But that's the essence of model cards. There's another kind that we've been more proactive on, and this is representative of the willingness of the government to let us be proactive in defining risk cards. I mentioned earlier that my company as a product offers a search engine, like Google for bad guys, that labels organizations and people with risk labels. And there's a responsibility that comes with that. You don't want to kind of haphazardly label a person or organization as bad if they're not, or if your definitions are unclear. So we really want to set up these artifacts, these risk cards, to document what the risks are, defining them very explicitly from what is human trafficking, what is wildlife trafficking, all these types of things, and putting in explicit metadata and defining the what of what we're actually talking about. And also, it's not us writing it necessarily, but it's us facilitating the conversation with domain experts and users such that they can teach us, right? So it's, in a way, we're the trainers and we're helping them train us. It's training the trainers of the models. And the caveat here is that this is not an official standard yet. This is something we're trying to innovate on, but it shows that there's room to shape the conversation. I'll go quickly over the last part here, but all these things have human processes behind them. There's training data processes, making sure that people should always be skeptical of their training data, because how you teach something is how it acts, and so you need to make sure it's representative. There's fair sampling. It's not inappropriate, and many definitions of the word inappropriate. You need to have model testing and monitoring. Really, people don't think about this with ethics, but it has to work, right? If people's lives are on the line, it has to work. And so how are you making sure that it works performance-wise, not just once, but continues to? So you need, to check for model rot, have a semi-frequent process to make sure that it's not slipping, and then maybe not, shutting the system down, but putting a notice up for refresh if you need it. There's also user tests, and when you're doing user tests, you're usually testing bragging about how efficient you are and stuff, but you need to also look at the trade-off of that, saying, are you too efficient and that there's irresponsible usage happening and people are misinterpreting the results and trusting it too much. So to finish, you really need to have a full stack view here. Like, we call it responsible AI, but it's also responsible products as a whole. And it's not just on the model builder. A backend engineer could screw up a feed. The UI designer can miscommunicate the otherwise good results, wherever state their confidence, and the results need to be transparent enough. We can lead you to water, but you have to be able to see the water before you drink as a user. So it's good to have that healthy paranoia across the stack, and to make sure nobody's dropping the ball. But that's all I had to say for now. A lot I didn't cover, but hopefully this gives a flavor of the kind of things we're working on.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, John. Yeah, and we thinking about this work. How is that feedback loop working? Bryce, do you want to talk a little bit about how the feedback is working between the two organizations?
I do. Yeah, I think the DoD, we can create a really positive feedback loop by engaging closely with our vendors. In this case, really we're focusing on workflow design. So the baseline is a human being who has to review 10 million documents to make a decision. And AI can't automate that decision away, nor do we want it to. But what it can help do is to prioritize those 10 million documents in a way where that analyst can all of a sudden gather far more information than they ever would have on their own. So we still need to have, in these cases, a human being making a decision. And there are certain areas where that's always going to be the case, right? It's not a question of, just the technology is not good enough. It's simply that we will never want to have a non-human entity making certain kinds of decisions. So we need to have appropriate workflows that take that into account, right? And ensure that in those applications, there is a human. Another point is that, all of the things we've been discussing so far need to have really strict test evaluation, verification, and validation procedures. And this is something that I think the DoD can really play a role in that will actually help to advance industry. Not just companies that are working with the DoD, but also taking those methodologies and applying them to work that they do with other customers as well. And that's something that we've had the pleasure to work with extensively with John. And I think it's a role that the government writ large has to play in helping the commercial AI sector to really be able to come around a common set of metrics, right? A common set of definitions and concepts, which we can then all mark ourselves against.
Excellent. Yeah, it's such important work. This is just really, really good to hear. John, could you talk about what lessons you've learned, what you're looking forward to next?
Yeah, I mean, overall, just to call it, I mean, it's a work in progress from everybody's perspective, right? I would encourage, though, like just, encouraging other vendors that may be in our position in the future to be proactive, like we've tried to be. I do think, this is more carrot than stick in lots of ways that, like, if you do this well, you'll be set up to, win more deals or have more, say in exactly, how you're working with the government. And it also, like, there's always a defensive attitude that sometimes comes with responsible AI. You're not doing it right, you're going to get slapped, right? And it's compliance. But there's also an offensive angle, like if you do it right and you do know where the lines are, you can get more aggressive on fighting the bad guys, right? And accomplishing the mission and not get stuck in this gray area where everyone's confused and hesitant to move because they don't know what's right, right? So that's one of the lessons. Other than that, it's all about transparency and exposure. Not being too close to the tech, of course, you're not going to give up IP, but you want to expose what you're doing, get issues on the table, have that radical transparency, draw the clear lines of acceptable and unacceptable model behavior, and really call out I'm looking forward to, like, as DIU has more of this, they're going to have successes and failures, and learning from those failures, really doing kind of war planning to know where we might fail and getting specific about it is important. So, and other than that, it's also just about diversity of stakeholders, like not just, it's called AI again, but that's like, it's not just on the data scientist on the corner, right? Right. They need to have that, all the help from the users to the rest of the team on to know that they're interpreting things correctly and implementing models that work.
Yeah, and particularly with that last point, the diversity of a team is going to really help the whole team to think differently and to ask questions. It's a great point. And I love the radical transparency. Bryce, what are some of the lessons you've learned? What are you learning right now, and what do you look forward to next?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we've learned, not to pat John on the head too much, but the fact is, I think what's worked really well with this relationship is that Quantifine's taken a view of, like, this is something we're co-developing, right? I mean, we're all somewhat new to not new to building AI models, but new to deploying in this particular circumstance. And so rather than having a sort of shields up approach where we're just constantly trying to protect one another or ourselves rather, being able to have that free flowing conversation and that trust really between the government and vendor. I mean, that is just so important, right? And that's the kind of thing, it's intangible. You can't write it into a contract, but it's certainly the kind of thing that I hope our guidelines sets out to establish, right? Because we're really trying to set up an environment in which we're asking questions that we know there are no, one right answer to. And so people are allowed to sort of wrestle with them, right? And it could be that there are cases where there isn't a super satisfying answer. And in that case, it really falls onto whoever it is on the DoD side who's the responsible owner of the mission to make that choice, right? We don't want to pretend that we can eliminate all risk. And so that's, I think, really important. And that really fits well within, I think, the military culture, where we have a very clear chain of command, right? And we're used to operating in areas of uncertainty. And we're used to being okay doing that because we know that we have really strong principles that guide our actions.
Excellent. Yeah. And let's shifting a little bit. What are some of the challenges ahead for responsible AI? Where do you see things going next?
So I think one of the things I'm really excited to see is the work that NIST has been doing. So they've got a workshop on October 19th and 20th, where excuse me, to discuss risk management frameworks. Ellum, who's over there, is phenomenal, and I'm really excited to see how that goes. The JAIC, which we work really close with, they've been also focused, extensively on thinking about how do you really operationalize and scale this to the entire department, and that's a huge challenge, right? We're kind of fortunate at DIU that we are small, so we really can get down into the into the trenches and into the weeds quite a bit on our projects. Of course, when you talk about scaling that to a really large enterprise, it gets into questions around governance with a lowercase g. How do we create the appropriate reporting structures, the appropriate lines of accountability, and education? That's a really, really, really. I mean, it's kind of an obvious, but it's just so important. And really, it's got to start off with like understanding what it is that we as the government are buying, and if we don't know what it is that we're buying, there's no way that we're buying that's ethical or responsible to do. So before we even get into thinking about ethics training per se, like we need to bring up the level of literacy around these programs. That doesn't mean turning everybody into a Python engineer, but it means getting people comfortable with understanding what these systems can, what their limitations are, how they perform, at a high level, and that sort of thing. I'd love, John, to hear from you also, like what you're kind of encountering.
Yeah.
I think it's about looking forward to all the guidance that you're talking about coming from other places like NIST. As a former physicist, I appreciate NIST standardization, and we try to take that attitude, even if things can't get as crisp as NIST is usually, because ethics is a murkier domain. Then we very much look forward to that. And honestly, it's just follow through. I mean, things with government take time, and so we're really looking forward to like keeping it going and getting into a steady state on this. Like we're still kind of in the honeymoon phase and the workup phase and the for this particular project, but ideally every project gets to a point where you're monitoring, right, and you're evolving. Like I'd say with machine learning models, it's like being a historian with data, right? But sometimes history change, like the world changes, and you're going to have to change with it. So it's the same with ethics and controls around that like it's not set it and forget it. You have to keep up, and so like getting into that flow is really what we're looking forward to.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you both for a wonderful discussion. And let's keep the conversations going, making responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable AI systems. And please watch the diu.mil site for the report coming out in the next few weeks from the DIU on responsible AI. And Bobby, back to you.
Thanks, guys. Right on time. That was great. Just right on time. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bryce, so much for your time this afternoon. And really, thanks to all of our panelists up to this point.